Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. And today we are once again talking about SolarWinds, and I'm bringing everybody up to date. Now, the last time I did a SolarWinds video was on the 16th. So about 6-7 days ago or so is when I put this out. And there has been a ton of information that has come out since. The size and the scope of this are shifting, adjusting, and changing. And a lot of information is just absolutely bonkers. So I want to bring everybody up to date. Some of this information, if you watch my video from a week ago, is going to be the same, but there's a ton of new information, so stick around. And with that, let's start with the basic timeline of attack. That really hasn't changed since last week, but let's go through this quickly before we get to this more updated information that is just alarming. So with that, on Tuesday, the 7th of December, FireEye revealed that they had essentially their own attack and were breached. They obviously went to investigating. That was a huge problem. On the 8th, all news outlets started reporting on this, and the Wall Street Journal, as far as I could tell, was the first to mention Russia as the most likely suspect for breaching FireEye. Now, on the 13th, FireEye reported that SolarWinds' Orion network monitoring solution had a vulnerability that was essentially allowing nation-state actors into thousands of companies and departments, including the US Treasury, the Commerce Department, and on and on and on. The Washington Post identified Advanced Persistent Threat, or APT-29, also known as Cozy Bear. This is a Russian intelligence cutout. They are believed to be the group that hit FireEye and the ones that got into Orion. Reuters also mentioned that as well. At this point, FireEye doesn't say if they're using Orion, just that they've identified this vulnerability. On Monday, 14 of December, Wired reported that SolarWinds disclosed to the SEC that as many as 18,000 organizations were possibly vulnerable to this attack. And the CISA, basically the cybersecurity wing of the Department of Homeland Security, orders all federal agencies to turn off SolarWinds products to attempt to mitigate what could potentially be the largest data exfiltration of government agencies and largest espionage in history. We are still quantifying that. And then on the 15th of December, Yahoo Finance reported that FireEye discovered the backdoor while probing its own breach, which is a de facto confirmation that FireEye was using Orion as well and is in that boat with those thousands of other companies now and government agencies. Now, with that, let's move on to the updates since December 16th. I put out that last video. This is all new information. So on the 16th itself, reports say that Microsoft actually took control of a malicious domain that was used by the Orion hackers and basically turned it into a kill switch to stop the SolarWinds Orion product from phoning home. That is from Krebs on Security, as well as a whole bunch of other news outlets. On Thursday, the 17th of December, the U.S. National Nuclear Security Agency was identified publicly as being a victim of this. This is actually the entity that holds the U.S. nuclear stockpile, so that is a huge problem. On Friday the 18th, we got a report, thanks to Krebs on Security, he does excellent reporting, that on the 7th of December, the National Security Agency stated, and I quote, "Russia state-sponsored malicious cyber actors are exploiting a vulnerability in VMware Access and VMware Identity Manager products, allowing the actors access to protected data and abusing federated authentication." Now, this came a day before FireEye disclosed their attack and is considered a possible vector for the SolarWinds attack. Basically, if you have unupdated or unpatched VMware infrastructure, go ahead and patch it now. But that might have allowed attackers in or given them another avenue to get into umpteen zillion organizations. If 18,000 people are using SolarWinds Orion, there are zillions of companies that are using VMware. They are a standard in infrastructure. So that is a huge problem that may dovetail with this, which is why I've included it here. On Saturday, the 19th of December, President Trump actually downplayed on Twitter Russia's involvement and pointed the finger at China, despite all contrary evidence, including public statements by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. I actually did a video on that entitled Blame Game. It was either yesterday or the day before. If you want more information on that, go ahead and take a look at that. But that was the first public utterance, despite all available evidence from cybersecurity outfits, researchers, and government agencies pointing the finger at China. Everybody is looking at Russia, given all of the IOCs or indicators of compromise that appear to make it look like, or appear that the Russians are the ones that are actually the culprit behind this. With that, we are not done, because there's been a ton of information that has come out since. On Saturday, the 19th of December as well, a second hacking group, different than the original Russian team that was identified that targeted SolarWinds. This second group targeted SolarWinds earlier in the year, according to Microsoft. And to quote, the investigation of the whole SolarWinds compromise led to the discovery of an additional malware that also infects SolarWinds Orion product, but has been determined to be likely unrelated to this compromise and used by a different threat actor. That is Microsoft's own quote coming from Reuters. So that is a huge, huge issue. SolarWinds essentially was allowing anybody to walk in, and we will get to that in this video and podcast. Also on Saturday, the 19th of December, Recorded Future identified 198 victims of this attack. It's according to Bloomberg. We will get into that very shortly. And on Sunday, the 20th of December, Chris Krebs, it is the former head of the CISA, again, that is the cybersecurity wing of the Department of Homeland Security, warned that the scale of the cybersecurity breach was, quote, probably more broad than the actual hacking of SolarWinds, which may dovetail with VMware, that second group, and everything else. But he also said that he would, quote, be very careful about escalating when he was asked if the United States should retaliate on this. This is according to Business Insider. And so we are basically in a very precarious situation, which also is exacerbated by the fact that President Trump is now pointing the finger at somebody else, even though all evidence points to the contrary. And finally, today, on Tuesday, December 22nd, cybersecurity researchers at TrueSec actually decoded part of the infection and generated a list of subdomains of the compromised companies. I went through that list. It is crazy. And so by virtue of that, let's talk about the organizations directly targeted that we know of. Now, in my last video last week, we talked about the companies that may have been targeted because they were using SolarWinds Orion. Now, these are companies we know that were directly targeted by virtue of Microsoft, TrueSec, and Recorded Future. Now, this is the US Department of Treasury, which we knew, the Commerce Department, also which we knew, the National Nuclear Security Administration, that's our nuclear stockpile, that one I just mentioned a little earlier, Intel, the Intel Corporation, NVIDIA, basically the video card maker, and they do a whole bunch more, but everybody knows them from their GeForce video cards, Cisco, basically the infrastructure creator and maker, Stratus Communications, Deloitte, one of the big four accounting firms. The Nevada Secretary of State, interestingly, was on the list, as were other states as well. But there was a lot of direct evidence that they were targeted. A ton of city governments globally, the city of this, the city of that, all over the place were on that list that was dumped out by TrueSec. And multiple banks, I saw the Bank of Punjab in India, and a whole bunch of others. So this is a global problem. Now, Microsoft themselves also identified a list of targets that they believe were attached to the Office 365 ecosystem that obviously was connected to this whole thing through Orion SolarWinds. And so Microsoft decided to break down exactly what the sectors were overall. And this is Microsoft's essentially pie chart on how the targets of the Orion hack have broken down. These are obviously subject to change as more and more companies we find out are being targeted. But as of a few days ago, when Microsoft put this out, and you can see the source is the Microsoft data, 44% are in information technology. These could be your infrastructure providers, your IT companies, all of these kinds of things. We are all buying infrastructure or managing and supporting it. So this is a very serious problem. Government clocks in at 18%, as does think tanks and NGOs. Government contractors, these are the ones that when we typically think about this as being a concern, we think about those that are in the DIB, or defense industrial base. I mentioned in my last video a week ago that Boeing was using the Orion software, although there is no confirmation that Boeing was targeted, although it would make sense that they would be. And then other, which is just the catch-all category of 11%. So as we were looking at this, we can see that we have a huge problem with information technology, not to mention governments. And as I also mentioned, this is worldwide because Orion was used universally in countries where you could get it, which was pretty much most countries on the planet. And so with that, before we dive in, SolarWinds was also warned, that we recently read in this source's Business Insider. They were warned in 2019 that anybody could access their update servers because the password they were using was SolarWinds 123. That's right. According to multiple reporting sources, and I'm cribbing from Business Insider here, SolarWinds 123 was the password they were using. They were warned in a cybersecurity audit, did nothing, and here we are. If that's not negligence, I don't know what is. This is why we need good password policies. This is why we need good identity management solutions with multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and behavioral control. That is crazy, and that is completely unacceptable. And with that, let's talk about the vulnerability. I also talked about it last week, and quite frankly, not much has changed, but I want to go over that again because this is going to be a comprehensive presentation, as I'm sure my next one will be the next time the bomb drops and we find out that everybody was targeted, including Santa Claus at this point. So with that, basically the Orion platform contained a vulnerability since March of 2020. This is outside the password that we know they were using that was weak on this, not to mention other vulnerabilities that I mentioned that we are now just discovering that I also mentioned earlier in this video and podcast. FireEye has labeled this backdoor Sunburst. So if you ever see Sunburst when they are talking about this, this is what they're talking about. This is the originating vulnerability that is getting everybody into trouble. Now, essentially, they hit a dynamic library link or DLL file, and this was a digitally signed component. They were able to digitally sign it so that it looked 100% legitimate and then insert it into the Orion software framework. And this contained a backdoor that communicated via unencrypted web traffic, HTTP, to third-party servers. Those are the ones that Microsoft and FireEye identified, and we will talk about that. Now, we are obviously, or rather, FireEye is saying that they are tracking Trojanized versions of this and labeling it as Sunburst. Now, they understood that the characteristics of this was that once you installed this update from Orion, SolarWinds Orion, and you installed the infection into your network, it would go dormant for up to 2 weeks. Then it would go live and execute commands called jobs, which allowed it to do things like transfer files, execute files, profile the system, disable system services, and even reboot the infrastructure. The other problem that we may have here is that if it's able to execute files, it could also be installing other infections into a network. So the Russian SVR Cozy Bear APT29 might have been able to download other infections across the network outside of, let's say, computers that were managing Orion. They may have also been able to install firmware infections as well, which means if you are able to infect the hardware of a solution, you can wipe out the operating system and rebuild it, and the firmware infection stays. So this is a huge potential issue that we have here. A lot of this is still being discovered, and hopefully it's not going to go that far. But if you had Orion, it is very possible that now you have multiple infections, dormant or active, in your network, thanks to the ability for somebody malicious to get in and start installing this anywhere and everywhere that they could. Not to mention if you're using weak passwords on your infrastructure, like your firewall password is password, they might be able to get into your firewall and start getting that information as well. Now, the reason why this was slippery is because it masquerades basically as the OIP, or Orion Improvement Program, which is their protocol, and then it stores its results essentially within a legitimate plugin, so it blends in with legitimate SolarWinds activity. It's going to look like any kind of outputted file that you would normally see from this product, and so people just glossed over it. And so essentially it was delivered via the update service, as I mentioned, which means that we are now looking at possibly all SolarWinds update services being compromised. So even if you're not running SolarWinds Orion, you might be running SolarWinds RMM, for example. At the moment, quite frankly, it can't be trusted because we simply don't know how far yet they've gotten. Now, if you recall, and I mentioned this last week, from what we understand, law enforcement actually raided SolarWinds offices in Texas and started removing equipment so that they could do forensic analyzation. And as soon as we have reports, believe me, I will be talking about that. But this is a huge, huge problem. And so the next slide is, how the heck did everybody miss this? How did we miss this? I mentioned this last week as well, and it's essentially the same thing. The US government has spent billions of dollars developing a threat detection system across the internet in the United States called Einstein, and it totally missed it. Think about those unified threat managed next generation firewalls or detection systems of virtually every make and model that was simply missing this traffic as well. Basically, because this infection came directly from SolarWinds as an update, and was using a digital sign certificate and was installing backdoors using the OIP protocol from SolarWinds, essentially everybody was putting this on their allow list or their white list, and that is a huge, huge problem. As we are looking at this, essentially everybody was giving it a free pass because it was SolarWinds Orion, which is essentially that extension of trust that we place when we are buying software. We are trusting the maker to keep it secure and not use passwords like SolarWinds 123. Further, as I mentioned, it's relying on the protocol. So essentially, as I said, it was getting a free pass. I just remembered my point from last week. So those are the nuts and bolts. Those are the updates. We're seeing more and more companies hit. We are seeing multiple threat actors getting into SolarWinds before the bomb dropped and this was disclosed. This is a complete mess. This is a complete disaster right now, and hopefully we'll be able to contain this. But as we are looking at understanding the scope, just how far this got infected, or just how many companies got infected out of the 18,000, and according to The Verge, there were actually 33,000 customers on Orion, 18,000 were disclosed to the SEC, and the entire customer base for SolarWinds in general for all products was over 330,000 customers, which is governments, entities, and companies around the globe. So this is a huge problem. It will continue to be an issue. And obviously, as this evolves and this unfolds, I will probably be doing another video on this in this vein, simply because we just don't know what is going on right now. And so some of this will be a rehash, but I will continue to add to this as it grows and grows and this problem becomes worse and worse. And so that is your news of the day. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. And right now, stay the heck away from any SolarWinds product. Thanks, everybody.